see on the welcome screen. Today's webinar is funded by the U.S. Department of Energy's Sunshot Solar Outreach Partnership and will focus on solar energy solutions for transportation, improving air quality, and saving fuel with idle reduction technology. I'll start today's webinar with a brief overview of the partnership. And for those of you who have not participated in an ARC webinar before, the format will be a presentation followed by a question and answer session from our attendees. If you have any questions during the presentation, please either raise your hand or type a question in the questions box in your control panel. We'll save all questions until the end of the presentation. Please also note that a copy of the presentation will be made available and sent out to you in a follow-up email. So with that, let's get started. The Sunshot Solar Outreach Partnership is a U.S. Department of Energy program designed to increase the use and integration of energy in communities across the United States. We do this through a mix of educational workshops, peer-to-peer sharing opportunities, research-based reports, and online resources. And I'll touch a little bit on additional resources at the end of this webinar. Partners include the National Association of Regional Councils, the International City-County Management Association, and ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability, along with the other fine organizations that you see on your screen. So next, I'll turn it over to Eric Zimmerman, NARC's Director of Transportation Programs.
Thanks, Mia. Today's webinar focused on air quality and fuel savings with idle reduction technology is the first in what will be several opportunities to explore specific uses of solar energy within the planning and operation of our transportation system. Idle reduction represents an excellent opportunity that can lead to direct air quality benefits and help reduce fleet operating costs. In some areas, idle reduction is mandated, but even where it is not, there are tremendous benefits that can be realized from implementing such a program. That is what we will explore today. Our first speaker is Amanda Brimmer, Principal Air Quality Planner for the North Central Texas Council of Governments in Dallas, Texas. She will highlight the benefits of idle reduction. After that, we'll hear from eNOW Incorporated. With us today are Carol Ridley, who does marketing for the company, and Bob Doan, their Chief Technology Officer. They will highlight their own solar-based solutions to this problem, the eNOW solar-powered battery system. With that, Amanda, take it away.
Fort Worth region. And this is Amanda Brimmer. I'm with the North Central Texas Council of Governments. We are the regional planning organization for the Dallas-Fort Worth region. So basically, we oversee the planning for transportation, environment, and energy in our region. So today I'm going to be covering locally enforced idling restrictions in the state of Texas and some of the challenges faced by local governments in reducing emissions associated with idling. So first slide, please. So to start, I just wanted to give some background information on idling and why it is of concern. So it's basically four-pronged as far as the issues with idling. The first being health. There's two issues with health. First being the immediate, the impacts of exhaust inhalation, actually inhaling diesel exhaust at the source. Diesel has been known as carcinogen, so there's definite immediate impacts as far as inhaling diesel at the source. But the second, somewhat secondary impact of diesel is going to be the impact of poor air quality. In the Dallas-Fort Worth area, we are in non-attainment for the National Ambient Air Quality Standard ozone. We have been for 23 years, so we have quite a bit of experience with this. It's not that we haven't been making any progress, it's simply that we were chasing an ever-moving target. The standard keeps getting tighter, thus as we're making progress, we have even more to go simply because of that ever-moving target to help protect human health. But as far as being a non-attainment, we are required to develop what is called a state implementation plan. That is basically our clean air plan for the region. That's telling the Environmental Protection Agency how we plan to come into compliance with the national standard. And since 2008, idling has been one of those strategies. In our area in particular, we are what is known as NOx limited. As far as ozone goes, it's nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds combined, and those two create ozone. And so in our area, NOx is our driving factor, which is why most of our control strategies will focus on the NOx emissions. And looking specifically at NOx, about half of our NOx emissions does come from on-road, and within that, about 44% comes from heavy duty. So it's a very big chunk of our emissions that are coming from the heavy duty vehicle sector, which is why a lot of our strategies focus on trying to reduce emissions from that area. So that kind of covers health. The second aspect is environment. So nationally, about 200,000 tons of nitrogen oxides are emitted each year from heavy-duty idling, about 11 million tons of carbon dioxide, and then also related to the environment is elevated noise levels. We do hear quite a few complaints through some of our education programs, which I'll touch upon in a minute, but elevated noise levels is really the #1 complaint we hear, particularly in neighborhoods related to idling. Their complaint is, hearing the idling all night. So that's a huge, I guess, concern for us related to idling. The third being energy security. Almost 700 million gallons of diesel fuel are burned each year from heavy-duty vehicles, or particularly the 18-wheelers annually. And then the money. With idling, you're basically getting 0 miles per gallon, so the worst fuel economy you can get. EPA estimates long-haul truckers are idling up to 1,800 hours per year. So that paired with our high gas prices or high diesel prices right now, that's roughly $7,500 a year being spent just on idling. So there's not only a noise and health benefit associated with it, there is a financial benefit to both the driver and the company running the vehicles to reduce idling. And then lastly, simply decreasing the engine life and increased maintenance costs with the idling if it's unnecessary idling. Next slide, please. So I just want to give a bit of background as far as why we are concerned in our area. It's not just the non-attainment and emissions issues, but also looking at congestion. We have a plan, a long-term or a long-range transportation plan looking out to 2035, and so based on our projections, there's going to be a very large increase in congestion in our area. So comparing today to 2035, you can see the red area is showing, Upper Dallas and Tarrant, Collin County, kind of our core areas are going to see a huge increase in congestion, and a lot of that is due to, a good thing, economic growth, but with economic growth also comes population growth, which means more demand for goods, and with those demand for goods means more demand for the trucks to bring those goods. That's more emissions and more idling associated with those trucks. So, we've already struggled at this point to reach non-attainment. Now we're going to be having more vehicles in our region, so idling is only going to become more important to handle in the future. Next slide, please. So an overview on the state of Texas idling rule, which is in the Texas Administrative Code. The rule basically states that no gasoline or diesel vehicle over 14,000 pounds gross vehicle weight rating can idle for more than 5 minutes when the vehicle is not in motion. There are quite a few exemptions to this rule, the state rule in particular, one of the biggest being an exemption for drivers that are on their government-mandated resting period. If they are on that resting period, they are exempted from the rule and allowed to idle, unless there are a couple other, I guess, anti-exemptions to that. But that's kind of the blanket one that covers a lot of the idling in our region. There is an exemption for airport ground support equipment, military, emergency law enforcement, and armored vehicles. There is a 30-minute maximum for buses in the area, and that is strictly for passenger comfort. If the bus driver is sitting at a museum waiting for children for 3 hours, he or she would not be allowed to idle. But if it was starting up to cool the bus down prior to the children boarding, that would be an allowed exemption. And then there's also a certified clean idle engine exemption. This was added a few years ago. If you can see in the upper right-hand corner, there's a picture of a decal, which you may have seen on a lot of heavy-duty trucks. That is an exemption to this rule as well. So if it has been certified, it is allowed to idle. There are a couple other exemptions for operations. If the engine is being used for a power source for mechanical operations, such as in a utility truck, needing to power the PTO to operate the boom, that would be allowed, or that would be an exemption. Also maintenance, diagnostic purposes, traffic congestion. And then the last related to location, if a jurisdiction has adopted this rule and they do have truck stop electrification within their jurisdiction, then no one is allowed to idle within 2 miles of that truck stop electrification or on-site electrification infrastructure. That, of course, assumes that there are available spots. The point of this is try to get people to use that technology. If the technology is used up and they're not available, then you would be allowed to idle if you fall under one of the other allowed idling exemptions. So that's kind of the whole top-level view of the state idling rule in Texas. Next slide, please. So how adoption works in our state. We don't necessarily have the luxury of being able to push things from the top down because of the way the state legislature is structured here, and each city being able to make up their own decisions on what they will and will not enforce. And so the way it works here is every city, every county has to adopt the state rule or some ordinance in order for it to be in effect. So basically the two options that a city would have is to either adopt their own anti-idling ordinance or to sign a memorandum of agreement with the state environmental agency, which is the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, and that basically transfers enforcement authority from the state to that local jurisdiction to enforce it. So it's pretty much an either or. If the city was wanting to do something more strict than the state rule, they would go the idling ordinance route. They may be able to reduce the amount of time someone is allowed to idle. They may be able to expand it to more vehicle classes, but they have a lot more liberty to strengthen the rule by doing it on their own. And then once it is adopted, then the city, it's up to them, the city, county, to determine who exactly is going to be implementing this, both the education and the enforcement components. Is it going to be code enforcement? Is it going to be the environmental department? Is it going to be law enforcement? So that's really up to the local jurisdiction as far as how they roll this out. At the Council of Governments, we have developed quite a few outreach items for local governments to use. One in particular is our local government guide. This is a 40-page document that walks through all of these steps from adoption to education to enforcement, sample processes on enforcing, I guess, implementation plans, and whatnot, just kind of helping local governments walk through it so it's as painless as possible. And we've also developed anti-idling posters and street signs. You can see a picture of that in the lower right-hand corner. These are available free of charge to any jurisdiction or business within that jurisdiction as well if they choose to post these. They are 18 inches by 24 inches, standard signs that you would see on the side of the road, such as a speed limit sign or whatnot. So they are able to withstand the elements. We also have a driver education brochure. This is available in both English and Spanish because we have quite a large Spanish-speaking population down here, and those are also available free of charge. And then we have an idling complaint hotline and website. So if someone is out and they see a vehicle idling, they can either call it in or visit our website and let us know the license plate, the location and time that they saw it. And we are able to look that up in our state registration database and send the person or the owner of that vehicle a letter letting them know you were spotted in an area that has an idling restriction. Idling is bad because of all the health reasons, environmental reasons, and here's some possible resources to help you not idle in the future, either technology or just driver behavior. So all of that is available on our website, which is engineoffnorthtexas.org, and that's kind of our portal of all things idle reduction at our agency. Next slide, please. So in Texas, in particular, North Texas, there have been 29 jurisdictions that have adopted this rule since 2008, and statewide it's 42 entities that have adopted. So far we have pretty good coverage. In our area we have 238 actual member governments of the Council of Governments, so there's definitely some room for more of them to sign on, but our core cities, Dallas and Fort Worth, are covered by this so far, and we have been in discussion with Denton, so it's looking like they may come on soon. So we should have a pretty large majority of our population covered by idling restrictions, we're hoping, by the end of the year. Right now I think it's about 60%. If we get Denton on, that'll be closer to probably 70%. So we're having a pretty significant impact in our region, but we'd love to get everyone on board in the future and have this whole map green, so that's what we're working towards. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges that we are finding in Texas, I already kind of touched upon the city-by-city, county-by-county approach. We're also finding quite a bit of lack of enforcement within the jurisdictions that have adopted this. It's not necessarily that they're not wanting to enforce. It's more an issue of it's time-consuming. An officer actually has to be there with a stopwatch, timing 5 minutes of idling before they can go provide a citation. So they're finding that education is the easier component or the easier route to go. They also, Texas is very business friendly, and so they're finding that it's not very business friendly to go out and start ticketing these businesses simply for idling. And then simply there are a lot of exemptions to the rule, at least the state rule in particular, so it becomes a bit prohibitive for the officer to be able to go down the checklist of, are you this, are you that, are you on your government-mandated resting period, is it diagnostics? So most jurisdictions are finding that the educational route is the easier route to go, and so they're doing a lot of that, beefing that up a whole lot. There's a lack of options for drivers not to idle. We've also found this for many years. With the state rule, there was a rolling 2-year expiration of some of the exemptions, simply because the legislature did not feel that there was enough technology options out there, but was hopeful that those would come aboard shortly. And about every 2 years, that got reinstated, simply because there was not yet the technology there. In about 2009, that expiration actually they got rid of it in the legislation, so it's basically a blanket exemption from this point forward, simply because, again, there's just not enough technology out there that's reasonable for most drivers to get their hands on, as far as the legislature is concerned. So we're hoping to change that, but as of right now, that's kind of what's going on in the region. There's too few truck stop electrification sites out there. You know, we've been very instrumental in getting funding and working with businesses and local jurisdictions to get these things built, but it seems like every time we get one up, another one either goes out of business, moves. So we seem to have a steady number out there. It's hard to actually make a dent in getting more of them in the region, but the ones that we do have are well utilized, so it is a useful technology. It's just trying to get more out there and get them to be consistently available for these drivers. There's too few funding opportunities, particularly for onboard technology. In the state of Texas, we have the Texas Emissions Reduction Plan program, and there's a lot of funding that goes to this program to help with air quality programs. So there is a fee associated with every heavy-duty vehicle purchase that goes into this fund, and historically they have funded onboard technologies, particularly APUs, battery packs, whatnot. But we're running into an issue of reporting, particularly with the long-haul fleets. It does get to be difficult to track exactly how much of that emission reduction is happening in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And so the state has had a hard time tracking and ensuring that we're actually able to credit those to our state implementation plan. So as of the last couple of years, they actually haven't been funding that technology through their program, just because of fear of double counting. And then the third being drivers' lounges are often not feasible to build. They may be on someone's property, feasible to build, but lots of these trucks that are idling are not actually on the company's property. So it's not necessarily feasible to build some spot for the driver to go, so they don't need to idle. So we're not seeing a whole lot of that happening in our region either. And then lastly, I touched upon this a bit, there are just a lot of exemptions to the state rule in our state, so that does become a challenge in our region. Next slide, please. So that pretty much sums up local enforced idling restrictions, but I did want to touch upon one last thing, just to kind of give you an idea of the spectrum of strategies being implemented at the COG related to solar. This is a fairly new area for us. Our Environment Development Department here has had a bit more experience, but we're very excited to start seeing a transportation tie to solar. In particular, I'm in the Transportation Department, so that makes it a bit easier for us to justify working on solar when there is that transportation tie. So in particular, some experience related to solar. We've been partnering with the National Association of Regional Councils for the Solar Ops Workshop back in May of last year. We've been participating in the Solar Ready 2 project under the Sunshot Rooftop Solar Challenge. We've also been seeking leverage for that transportation connection, in particular parking structures, carports, street lights, idle reduction, solar idle reduction technologies. So looking to kind of delve into all that related to transportation, and then promoting innovative solutions. Local governments installing solar at their facilities, electric vehicle charging stations throughout the region, both public and private, and then also EPA SmartWay verified technologies. So just trying to delve in it in every aspect that we can kind of under our organization. So last slide, please. And this is my contact information, as well as a couple of my colleagues, Lori Clark, who works on our non-road side, as well as our solar and energy side, and then Shannon Stevenson, who we also work with. And then this is our website, again, Engine Off North Texas, and I will take answers at the end of the webinar, or questions at the end of the webinar. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Now I'll turn it over to Bob Doan and Carol Ridley. You're both unmuted.
Terrific. Thank you, Mia. And my name is Carol Ridley. I'm with Marketing with eNOW Incorporated, and joining me today also is Bob Doan, Chief Technology Officer for eNOW. eNOW is a clean technology company based in Rhode Island, and our systems essentially use solar panels mounted on vehicle rooftops to generate power to run auxiliary systems such as air conditioning, lift gates, or lighting, or even refrigeration. So this allows the auxiliary power system to operate without the truck having to idle. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the ways that public and private fleets can reduce costs and emissions using idle reduction technologies. We'd like to tell you a little bit more about our solar technology and give you a sense of some of the other more conventional idle reduction technologies that are out there, and demonstrate how the solar technology compares with those conventional approaches. Next slide, please. So first, I just want to take a moment to talk about the scope of the problem, and I think Amanda did a very good job touching on many of these points. First, why do trucks idle? Well, primarily they idle because they need to operate an auxiliary system. If it's a long-haul truck, oftentimes that's a situation where the driver needs to maintain heating or cooling on an overnight period, so there's several hours of operation required. So that could be a substantial amount of idling required if there aren't idle reduction opportunities available to them. It may also be for refrigeration, liftgate operation during a delivery cycle for a vehicle, lighting, as we mentioned before. So there are many reasons why trucks may need to idle for a short period or a long period, and also buses as well were mentioned as among the vehicles idling. And this is a problem for a number of reasons. First of all, idling consumes a lot of fuel, about a gallon of fuel per hour, which can constitute about 8% of a vehicle's total fuel use for the year. And across the country, we're talking about over 1 billion gallons of diesel fuel being consumed each year for idling alone. On a per truck basis, it could be as much as 2,500 gallons of diesel fuel per year consumed simply for idling. This has a huge cost on the bottom line for a fleet, whether it's a public or private fleet, and that ultimately gets transferred into the cost of goods and services. So it's something that really can eat into the bottom line in the operating budgets of public and private fleets. Next slide, please. It's also a serious environmental problem. Medium and heavy-duty trucks account for about 6% of all greenhouse gas emissions and 20% of greenhouse gas emissions for the transportation sector. And there's, obviously a huge magnification of this problem when you consider that 70% of all goods and services in this country are moved by some form of truck. And you consider there are 25 million medium and heavy-duty trucks in operation in the United States today. So there's a huge opportunity incentive here to identify ways to reduce fuel use through idling, to address some of these significant economic and environmental impacts associated with idling. Next slide, please. And so for that reason, as Amanda addressed in Texas, a number of cities and states and counties across the country are implementing no idle or idle reduction laws. By our count, and it sounds like the number's going up rapidly in Texas, but by our count we've got about 28 states and 20 cities and counties already with laws on the books. And these are pretty significant regulations. They can have very stiff fines associated with them, as much as $5,000 per incidence for a multiple offender in some cases. So they're definitely a regulation to be taken seriously, and they are being taken seriously by truck fleets across the country. There are also a number of federal and state executive orders and emission control regulations, fuel efficiency requirements that are being added for consideration through EPA, through the California Air Resources Board. The California Air Resources Board, or CARB, also has a certification and verification program for idle reduction technologies to assist fleets in meeting those strict state standards in California. So they certify technologies that can be sold in the state, and they verify certain anti-idling or idle reduction technologies for their use in the state in terms of meeting California's requirements. So these regulations really can help us all address those environmental and economic problems associated with idling, and they're certainly having an impact. Next slide, please. There's also been a strong federal response through a series of regulations over the past decade to control emissions from heavy-duty vehicles beginning in 2004, ramped up again in 2007 with the heavy-duty highway rule, which was the second phase of emissions controls at the federal level. And then in 2011, fuel efficiency standards were added to emissions controls through the greenhouse gas emissions requirements for heavy-duty vehicles and engines. Another program that many people are familiar with is the Diesel Emissions Reduction Act and the National Clean Diesel Campaign. These are the programs through which a lot of federal money flows to the states directly and to regional air pollution control organizations in the states to make available to public and private fleets to help adopt emissions reduction technology, idling technology, and that sort of thing. The Smart Way verification program comes out of the Diesel Emissions Reduction Act also. This is a well-known program that verifies anti-idling technologies as meeting certain emissions reduction standards and providing certain performance standards, kind of a good housekeeping seal of approval, if you will, for anti-idling technologies. So another step that the federal government has taken to encourage adoption of these important technologies. Next slide, please. The industry has also responded to the need to reduce idling in light of the regulations that we've discussed, but also the significant economic impact idling has on the industry in terms of wasted fuel use. So there's multiple benefits from adopting anti-idling technologies, meeting the regulations, reducing fuel consumption, definitely improved engine maintenance and extended battery life in many instances. And both of those factors, the fuel consumption reduction and the extended maintenance and battery life, will significantly help to reduce operating costs for fleets. It's also noteworthy that adoption of these types of technologies and addressing the environmental issues associated with idling and extra fuel use certainly can contribute to sustainability goals, which are increasingly important for a number of businesses and fleets across the country. But at this point, there's still a long way to go. A recent survey by the American Transportation Research Institute found that 36%, or just a little over a third of the trucks surveyed, use some type of idle reduction. So it's out there, it's being used, but there's still a large part of the transportation sector that has yet to adopt this technology. Next slide, please. This is a quick overview of a number of different conventional idle reduction technologies, just to give you a range of what's out there, and Amanda touched on a couple of them also. But just to quickly go through and discuss some of the pros and cons of these different types of idle reduction systems, beginning with the automatic engine idle control systems. These essentially use it's a power and heat is supplied from the truck's engine, and an intelligent switch turns the engine on and off throughout the rest period to start the engine or stop the engine to provide the amount of idling needed to provide power to the auxiliary system. So this is a reliable approach, and it can provide the full amount of cooling power needed for the air conditioner if that's the use in the case. But it does require the engine to run, so that will limit your emission savings and it will increase the fuel use. It can also add to engine wear and tear and can be very noisy. Truck stop electrification, which Amanda touched on, is quiet and can provide long powers of heating and cooling. This is essentially a truck stop where a truck can literally plug into shore power, is another term for it, that is usually provided from some grid source of electricity and provide power to the auxiliary systems. So a vehicle has to pay for this service, and one of the main drawbacks is the lack of availability of these truck stop electrification sites across the country. So it's hard to plot a vehicle voyage that's going to have adequate truck stop electrification. And I think part of the shortage is owing to the fact that these systems are extremely expensive to build and install. So it's not only expensive to utilize them, but expensive to build them. So although they can be effective, they're in very short supply and really can't be relied on by a fleet for their anti-idling needs. The next technology here is the diesel-powered auxiliary power unit, or APU, which basically has a small diesel engine which is dedicated to providing the auxiliary power for heat or other auxiliary needs. So this can provide long periods of operation, but it's a small engine. It's noisy. It requires fuel use, so it generates emissions. And actually, EPA is getting a little stricter in California. The state of California also are getting a little stricter about the use of diesel auxiliary units because they generate particulate matter, which is an air pollution concern. So they now require the use of expensive filters to filter out the particulate matter. The next level of or idle reduction systems is battery-powered systems. These tend to be very quiet and reliable systems. They are battery-powered, so they are basically charged by a grid source of power, and they use a lot less fuel than some of the other technologies we've discussed. They are lower emissions than those other technologies as well. One of the limiting factors is loss of battery charge and the ability to provide the 8 to 10 hours of power that's needed for some of these long heavy-duty truck vehicle trips. They also increase load on the engine alternator, and there's oftentimes a concern about the amount of power output necessary to provide cooling. So while they're very quiet and reliable and perform better in terms of emissions and fuel use, some of their performance limitations are a consideration. And so that brings us to eNOW solar-powered systems, which work with battery systems but essentially use the solar panels mounted on the vehicle to provide the battery recharge, if you will, which means there's zero fuel use and zero emissions from the powering of those auxiliary systems. This also will help to extend battery life because power that's not used by the auxiliary system can be fed back into the battery or the alternator to help with other vehicle loads. One of the drawbacks is that there can be some, during extended periods of cloudy or dark periods, there can be some issue with generation of the solar power. And Bob is going to discuss some of these technical matters in more detail in a moment. But that gives you a bit of an overview of the range, sort of from the earliest to more recent, of a variety of idle reduction technologies that are available. Next slide, please. This slide is going to give you an overview of some of the cost impacts of these various systems and their performance. So on the left-hand column, from top to bottom, you see the different reduction technologies that we talked about and their annual fuel consumption, the cost of that annual fuel that's used to idle, and the equivalent cost of the electricity generated per kilowatt hour. And beginning with truck idling, just using the engine to idle, as we discussed, as much as 3,000 gallons of fuel per year at a cost of $4 a gallon. So we're talking about $12,000 a year for fuel use just for idling. And that is about $12 per kilowatt hour of electricity generated. So definitely not the economic option, nor is it the most environmentally preferable option. And then moving along, you can see the reduction in fuel consumption and cost per kilowatt hour. Diesel APUs, $2.76 per kilowatt hour, all the way down to the battery-powered systems, which greatly reduce fuel consumption, and therefore cost per kilowatt hour is 78 cents. But of course, the best performance here is by the solar power, which doesn't use any fuel use to run the auxiliary systems and is essentially a zero cost per kilowatt hour performance. So you have a little bit of an insight into some of the operational pros and cons of the various auto reduction systems out there, and this gives you a little bit of the economic performance of those systems, demonstrating, I think in both cases, that the solar-powered systems offer tremendous value and performance benefits in terms of reducing fuel use, generating electricity for zero cost, and reducing emissions to zero as well. So at this point, I'd like to hand it over to Bob, who will explain a little bit about how the solar technology works and provide a good case study of its application.
Thank you, Carol. Next slide, please. So the technology that we've worked on and developed is of three parts, mainly the solar panels that are located on the top of the trailer or on top of the truck, or even the air cowling that you'll see on the front of the tractors on Class A trucks. We've developed a power management system, and then, of course, to store that power for later use into auxiliary batteries. And the batteries typically are AGM or lead acid type technology currently found in the trucking industry, but we also work with some of the newer technologies like lithium ion batteries, which will give much greater performance and much longer life, however tend to be expensive to start with. Now, we also will take power off the vehicle alternator and a battery system, so that if you do have cloudy days or extended periods of darkness, we can maintain those auxiliary batteries off the alternator. And then we also, with the power management system, we will then delegate the power to the various auxiliary loads that could be found in a truck. That's most likely air conditioning, for cabin comfort, but it also can include some small electric refrigeration units for small delivery vans and trucks, as well as lift gates, which is a major problem in the industry, with liftgate batteries going dead during the delivery cycle because they're not charged properly. There's not enough time between stops to charge the liftgate batteries. The power management system also has the capability of taking excess solar production and putting it back into the vehicle electrical system. This has a further effect of reducing the amount of fuel use. When you reduce the load on the alternator, it reduces the stress on the engine, and the engine will have a small amount of fuel savings there. Next slide. One of the hearts of the technology that eNOW has developed is in the solar panel. Traditional solar panels are very heavy. They're made of glass. They're over an inch thick and will weigh, literally 40 or 50 pounds per 250 watts of panel. These are the panels that you typically find on houses and large fields of solar panels. This technology just does not work for the trucking industry. There's some very stringent weight contingencies that you can't add additional weight to the truck, which then would further add more pressure on the fuel. There's also height restrictions. The panels have to be very thin. They also have to be very durable. So what we have done is taken a cue, I think, from the thin film solar panel technology, which is a laminated process that encapsulates solar cells within a lamination of plastics, basically, that are very durable and lightweight. We did work a little bit with some of the thin film technologies like SIGs and amorphous silicon, but the issue there is that they do not produce enough power per square foot to be very economical for the trucking industry. Where you have limited space, you really have to increase your performance per square foot. So by taking traditional monocrystalline cells and putting them in a laminated process, you get a very thin panel that's literally only 4 millimeters or about a quarter of an inch thick, lightweight, less than a pound per square foot, yet have the higher power associated with glass panels of 13 to 15 watts per square foot. The panels are, as I mentioned, very durable with this Teflon-like covering, so it resists scratches. Trucks are noted for getting into neighborhoods where they'll get under trees and will tend to scratch the top. That's not an issue. They can take impact without breaking. Glass panels will crack and will stop producing power. That is not the case with these panels. I have lost the video. I don't know if that's an issue for everybody or not.
It's not showing up, though. We've lost video on here. We'll see what we can do. We apologize for that, Bob.
Okay. So I'll go ahead and discuss one of the next slides, and that's one of the test cases that we did for the Maine Department of Transportation. They have trucks, tool trucks, that sit on the side of the highway that would run traffic attenuators or the arrow board signs to have traffic move over, as well as beacons to let them know that they're there. Now they had Ford F-350 pickup trucks that would sit all day long, and they would have to idle to maintain those lights and traffic boards. So we installed a relatively small system, a 200-watt solar system on the tops of the vehicles, and to power their lights, so they stopped idling. Once they did that, they went from a fleet average of 6.6 miles per gallon to 9.8 miles per gallon. That was a savings of over $3,500 in fuel per year per vehicle. So when you look at that type savings, the payback for a system typically is around a year or less. And that's one of the things that we really focused on, is trying to get the payback down to under 2 years, because that seems to be the magic number for the trucking industry, that they will go ahead and use the technology if they can save that kind of money. And whenever you can stop idling, that's where your biggest savings is. So either through the air conditioning systems, the sleeper cabs for the operator to sleep at night, as long as they're not idling, they can save, in that case, up to $6,000 a year, down to the Department of Energy or Department of Transportation and police vehicles that will sit on the side of the road, as well as liftgate operators with liftgates on trailers or their trucks. They will tend to idle just to make sure their liftgates stay operational, and thus using up fuel. I think that was pretty much the extent of my slides. I don't think we've gotten any video back yet, have we?
I think the next slide was on the benefits, Bob, solar technology benefits.
Yeah, Carol, can you still see the slides? We're confirming
I see the slides, yeah.
Okay.
Does everybody have slides?
I think so, Bob.
Oh boy, I'm the only one. Oh, hold on one second. Let me. Yeah, so some of the different solar technology benefits is, of course, to meet the no idle and emission reduction requirements, and that, of course, reduces fuel consumption. One of the other features that we do have is that because of the solar charging, we can extend the battery life, because we take better care of the batteries by going through a process of trickle charging the batteries when they get full. Traditional alternators will tend to overcharge the batteries and shorten their life. And of course, by not idling, you're reducing your engine maintenance costs as well as your operation costs. And of course, the bottom line is we do reduce greenhouse gas emissions and meet company sustainability targets. And on a side note, our products have been approved by CARB, the California board there that does take a look at different equipment and say that do validate that, yes, they indeed do save greenhouse gases. So our initial payback is often a year or less, and the annual fuel savings will go on for as long as you own the vehicle, sometimes 10 to 15 years, with internal rate of return of usually 50 to 125% for the operator. And that does conclude what we had to add to this.
Thank you so much, Bob, Carol, and Amanda. Really appreciate you speaking today in the webinar. First, I'll take 2 seconds to plug some additional resources. I'd like to highlight the Solar Outreach Partnership website. This webpage hosts a wealth of resources that I touched on in the beginning of the webinar, including other webinars, podcasts, regional national workshops, events that are happening in and around your area, current solar news, and in-depth technical assistance. So I encourage everyone to check that out. Next, I'd like to transition over to the question and answer portion of the webinar. As a reminder, if you do have a question, please either raise your hand, the little hand button, or type the question into the questions box. And we do have a few questions already. So Amanda, Bob, and Carol, you're all unmuted. And the first question is for Amanda, and it was if you could touch a little bit on the role that the federal regulations played in NCTCOG's idle reduction technology.
Sure. The biggest role that the federal government has played as far as we're concerned is related to our state implementation plan. Quantifying emission reductions, they have some regulations as far as how much credit we can actually take for idle reduction, but then also the double counting issue. How exactly do we quantify it in our SIP process? And then, I mean, EPA has been very supportive in helping us push our idle reduction. They, approached us many years ago about truck stop electrification, onboard technology, so they're very supportive of us pushing that initiative. As of, I guess, a couple years ago, the state tends to make some changes to their state rule, adding more exemptions, adding more requirements, and generally the EPA is very quick to oppose anything that makes the state rule any less stringent, basically because of anti-backsliding regulations related to our state implementation plan. Anything we put in place for emission reductions, we're not allowed to undo those, or else we have to find other emission reductions to offset that. So the state has been, or the EPA has been very vocal in any attempts for the state to try to make our idling restrictions less stringent.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is also for you, Amanda, and it was so you mentioned the Texas emission reduction funding, but if you could touch a little bit more on how NCTCOG got their funding for this idle reduction technology.
Okay, and with that, I'm actually going to pass it over to Lori Clark, who has been a lot more involved with our funding of idle reduction technologies.
Hi. So we actually, most of the funding that we have devoted towards idle reduction technology has been through EPA's Diesel Emissions Reduction Act, the National Clean Diesel Funding Assistance Program. We received one grant that was just for truck stop electrification, one grant that was just for onboard idle reduction technologies, so that included the diesel auxiliary power units and battery air conditioners and whatever else they wanted, our applicants wanted, as long as it was an EPA verified technology. We did get one grant under during the Recovery Act, also under the same EPA program, for all SmartWay verified technologies. So we did several idle reduction items under that. And then we did use some funding from TCEQ's Texas Emissions Reduction Plan to do a little bit as well. But the majority of it has been through EPA.
Okay, great.
We have a question now for eNOW Incorporated. One, dealing with inclement weather, how durable are these panels, and how fast is the technology advancing in terms of dealing with extended periods of cloudy days and those sort of issues?
Sure. This is Bob. Cloudy days, even cloudy days and rain, that the panels will still produce power, clearly not nearly as much as when it is sunny. We have looked at various technologies like magnification or light concentrated technologies, but they really add more hindrance to the truck than adding them. So one of the things that is happening is that you are getting technology that's better at low light capturing, so that nearer the end of the days or definitely during cloudy weather, you do still collect quite a bit of power. We've done a lot of that with some of our electronics controllers, using some of the state-of-the-art electronics out there to ensure that you capture as much power off the panel as possible. From a durability standpoint, our favorite test is that we actually bring around panels that we shoot bullet holes through, and we compare that to a glass-type panel that we shot a bullet through. And our panels, with that lamination process, actually still produce power. So if you get an impact, and I mean a lot of people are concerned by hail and things like that, it may actually damage the very small area of the cell. So you might lose, maybe 0.5% of power or percent from that individual cell, but the total impact is pretty minimal over the entire panel itself. So I think that's one of the things that is a big concern in the trucking industry, that we feel that we've greatly solved through this lamination process.
Okay, great. Thank you. And we have another question for eNOW. Relating to Maine Department of Transportation, is there any other information or additional details or updates from them and how that's been going, or have there been any other either public or private entities that have started to use your systems, or are there plans in the works to work with any future entities?
Absolutely. We have a private company that has been using our system throughout Pennsylvania and Florida, and they basically contract to the state for road maintenance, and they've seen they do their stuff in terms of engine hours, and they saw a 40% reduction in engine hours, which we would assume directly correlates to the reduction in fuel. We've had a lot of inquiries from police departments and doing police cars. One of our challenges there is that finding enough space to put solar panels on. And traditionally, police departments use the large Crown Victoria vehicles, which had beautiful trunk space and can put lots of good solar panels on them. But of course, they've all that's been discontinued, and for good reason. They're really fuel hogs, and they've gone to the smaller Interceptor model, which is like a Taurus type car, and it's really made a challenge for putting solar panels on those. Although we do have some future technology we're just starting to play with, that's a whole different type cell arrangement that's going to allow us to actually build panels in unusual shapes to take advantage of unusual sizes and dimensions like that trunk. And yes, we're working with Rhode Island Bus Company, the Rhode Island Transportation Busing Company, to put solar panels on the bus to help with some of the residual electrical loads. So there are many other applications on that, and we are getting a lot of interest from different areas, Department of Transportation.
And I would just point out that on eNOW's website, www.enowenergy.com, there are a number of these case studies. The Maine DOT case study and some of the others that Bob has mentioned are there in case study format. So please check those out and contact us if you have further questions.
All right, thank you very much.
And our next question is back to NCTCOG. It's, can you talk a little bit more about what you're looking at in regards to solar carports?
This is Lori again. With that, we have several local jurisdictions or entities that have already installed solar carports or have installed solar arrays on the roof of parking garages, things like that. So we're very interested in promoting solar carports across the region, especially because we also house an electric vehicles program, and the nexus between the solar and the electric vehicles, we want to promote and kind of exploit that as much as possible to really make the point that electric vehicles can live off the grid and things like that. And so we'll be looking at that, and as part of that, we're trying to do some work to try to quantify the emission benefits that we could associate with a solar carport, whether that's from offsetting the grid-based electricity or reducing evaporative emissions because you're shading the vehicle, or, you know, that incremental that would be associated with the vehicle being able to go electric. Because then that would help us give more context as to where that might fit as a control strategy when we look at state implementation plan efforts and things like that. So that's really where our focus is right now, is doing the promotion and then trying to get those numbers behind it as a concept.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And that brought us right to 3 o'clock. So I'll just say thank you again to our wonderful presenters, and thank you as well to our attendees for your questions and feedback. As a reminder, you will receive an email within the next 24 hours with a link to the copy of the presentation. It'll also be available on NARC's website, narc.org. Thank you again for your attendance, and we look forward to your participation in future webinars. Have a great day.